to see if my stream actually seems to be happening. Oh, something strange is happening here as well. Okay, streamer says it's streaming. I'm just going to go to the countries. I'm already at the countries. I'm at the countries. I'm not the countries. Okay, I'm going to put something in the chat myself. The reason I'm a little concerned is that it shows me offline in my chat. Okay. Still says I'm offline. And you don't want to go just talk for 45 minutes if no one's going to be able to hear it. Stop streaming here and see if I restart if it gets better. All right, I'm just going to assume that people can hear me. Whatever. I'll do it again in a few days if you can't. So the countries then are looking about the same as they always do. United States far in the lead and accelerating. There's a little bit of sense that it may be leveling out. A little bit of good news there maybe. Brazil certainly is not as far above its trend line as the United States is, so that's good. We see India taking third place now, having passed Russia. India is still pretty small in daily cases per million, but as we always say, it is so huge, that it doesn't take too many daily cases per million to make a lot of people. So there's India. If we look at the daily cases per million graph, India is not here yet. I actually haven't recently calculated what its daily cases per million is, but it's just way behind everyone else. It doesn't have that big a problem adjusted for population. But it does have certain regions that are much hotter than others. So one of these days, India is going to get bad enough to show up here on our top 25 adjusted by population list, but that day does not seem to have come yet. I really wish I knew if I was streaming here. Actually, you know what I can do? I can go to my own channel and see if I'm streaming according to my own channel. Is it live? Am I live? Live now, it says. All right, I'm just going to assume that I'm live now. Okay. Well, sorry for the technical difficulties. I assume I'm streaming. It's a little hard to tell. But daily cases per million, we can see Qatar, which is off the chart, has been off the chart, now recovering, has been for a long time. There are all these small countries, small-ish countries, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Panama, interestingly, Qatar, Armenia, and then there's Chile and Brazil. So we still see this Central South America cluster. Of them, Panama is actually kind of looking the worst right now in that it's got more daily cases per million than Chile or Brazil. Brazil is not heading upwards super fast. And the rest of them are relatively small and scattered in Middle Eastern, and they're not part of the Central South America cluster. But if you go just a little bit further down here, I guess we have Kuwait as well, we eventually do find the United States. And daily cases per million, adjusted by population, the United States is still not that high, but it is definitely warm at 155. And still rising. So because of its population, in some sense, it is more significant than all these hotter countries above it. But Brazil is certainly close. And then Chile and Panama, finishing out the Americas, we still have a big problem here in the Americas. but there are no hot spots that are really large. That's one consolation, I guess. None of the biggest countries are really hot. Okay. I still have this vague sense that I may not be live, but oh well. As I said at the beginning, I'm not feeling super great today and my voice may give out, so we will see. This may be a very short live stream. So, heading back to, continuing on, we do have this new graph that sort of shows the trajectory of different countries since they got warm, since they hit 100 daily cases per million. And by the way, I also said this at the beginning, but I think my internet was cutting out when I did. I may not do counties of California today. Not only because my voice is going to give out before then, but also because the counties graphs are all whacked right now. The data source is messed up for some reason, and it shows no change for 4 days. So whatever happened 4 days ago in the live stream is pretty much still what's happening. I will be able to show California as a whole, but I'm not going to get useful information out of my California graphs right now. My county graphs. So I'm going to spend a little time on the countries, a lot of time on the states, because the states of the United States are still some of the biggest news and are showing motion. And then I probably will not do the counties today. You can get to my website, gregferrer.us, if you want to see the counties yourself. And there you will see probably that the graphs are all messed up, but hopefully they'll recover in a matter of days, hours even. So there are a number of counties that have done that are doing very well now, countries having hit that mark and peaked and dropped down, and these are, roughly speaking, these are the European countries. I spent a little bit of time because I just couldn't believe what I seemed to be seeing in some of the other graphs, which seemed to be suggesting that by my own nomenclature of 100 daily cases per million, meaning a warm spot, Italy never got warm. That just didn't seem right to me. New York gets into 1,000 and Italy never gets warm. Did Italy really never hit 100 daily cases per million? And I checked that out, and it really is true. Italy was such big news for so long that I just kind of have always assumed that it was as bad as New York, but never ever did it get anywhere near New York. Italy did briefly for a day or two pop above 100 daily cases per million, which meant it was a warm spot. But this graph doesn't show it at all, because this shows the 14-day average, and the 14-day average never rose above 100. It was only a few days that went above 100. Spain did, barely. You can see Spain here. Spain rose, not that barely, I guess. It was well into 150s. And then it recovered, went away. Belgium also had a slight case of it, but it's interesting to me that these, and here's, oh yeah, Sweden actually has only recently, fairly recently, in the past few weeks, gotten to 100. Switzerland, you can see Europe has followed a pretty good standard trajectory of it. It got to 100, it never got hot. Europe never got hot, and that still is kind of amazing to me, because back when Europe was the news, it seemed like Europe was hot. But compared to the United States, it's nothing. Here's the United States. Well, actually, okay, compared to some of the states of the United States, it's nothing. The United States also shows just a tiny little line, because it also only barely crossed 100 just a week ago. So we are seeing a little bit of a trajectory for the United States. Since it crossed 100, it keeps rising. Maybe it's starting to flatten out a little bit, but it doesn't have this long trajectory, because it was under 100 for a very long time, even though places like New York went much higher. All right. I'll show the rope chart, and then I think I'm going to move on to the states, because again, the news here is not that much different. The world is growing in daily new cases. it seems to be a lot of it is due to the United States, but then there's Brazil and Chile and maybe India coming up and Russia maybe. But the hottest of the hot spots in daily cases per million are these smaller countries. And the hottest of the hot spots, as we can see, I mean, here's Qatar, completely out of control at 700, but really much better now. Still hot, even now, still hot. 80 days later, it had this very high, very long peak that was much more than the more typical 60-ish day peak that we've been seeing in the States, and it still has not completely gotten over it, and nor has Bahrain, which never peaked as high, but hasn't really started declining yet. It's kind of flattened out. But these smaller countries, they've never contributed that many to the world, and so the world's numbers are really more about what the United States has been doing, and Brazil, Central South America. So just briefly then, looking at some of the states. Israel, interestingly, is really, really high in its growth rate right now. So that may be an upcoming hotspot. It does not have that many cases, but it's growing fast. 10%. Ecuador, also growing fast. Argentina, so you see that in the United States, you see the Americas still growing, these at 6%. However, let's look at Brazil and Chile. The good news is that two of the bigger spots, Brazil and Chile, in the case of Chile, has long since turned the corner and is headed towards recovery. Brazil still growing. It looked like it was going to recover, didn't quite make it. Growing at 2%, not too bad. And then the United States, which is still looking pretty bad. Now, if we look at just the United States, you can see there's some signs of hope recently. Some of these days are under 4%. Each of these days is an average of 7. Some of them are under 4%. Many of them are under the trend line. So the United States trend line might be starting to flatten out, but it certainly isn't really clear yet. This trend line is fairly reasonable given where the dots are. But there's some sense the United States might start to flatten out soon. All right, again, my voice is not happy right now, so I'm going to get on to the states of the United States while I still have voice left to spend. And I guess I didn't show, but the world is growing at something like 2% a day. A lot of that is due to the United States. We still have this weird thing with New York, which is just a data thing. There's something wrong with the data of New York. I'm just going to hide it. New York has recovered, pretty much recovered, and is staying there so far. There may be a second wave, but it's not obvious that there's going to be one in New York. So far, there's no evidence of that. So California, for sure, Florida and Texas, these are all states that have been growing fast and are well above their trend lines. There's something a little off about California. It hasn't really flattened out this way, I don't think. We just have the most recent day is missing, and so it looks like it's flattened very sharply suddenly. It has flattened a little bit, though. But when we look at the total California numbers, we can't believe them to be quite as good as this data set's going to be saying, because it's missing that day. And so it shows, well, another way of looking at it is in this graph. It shows 0 cases today, which is not true. Mostly the cases in California have been very high and seem to have been sharply upwards, but we do have 3 days in a row. The 0 is surely incorrect. This one might even be incorrect, but I believed it when I saw it yesterday. It's within the realm of the possible that California really did have 2,000 cases when it's been having 4,000. So maybe California is turning downward, but it certainly has not suddenly dropped all the way to 0. If we look at the daily cases per million, Arizona continues to be a real problem spot. 400 or 500 daily cases per million is a very high number. 200 is a hot spot. We see that there are a lot of states that are hot spots. in a whole lot of states that are warm or hot. There are only a few that aren't right now among the warmest. No, this isn't the warmest states. These are the top 25 warmest states, and many states are above that. I'm not even gonna list them off. There are so many, but it's worth looking. Let me head down to the rope chart for a minute, and just look at that gang of 6, because if there's any news here today, I'd say the biggest news from my perspective is that gang of 6 continues to show signs towards recovery. They're not recovered, they're still growing in many cases, but they keep angling slowly downward. A couple weeks ago, this gang of 6 here, the 3 A's, Arizona, Arkansas, and Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah, these were just sharply angled upwards. They were accelerating away. Their growth rates were rising. You look at this now, and these growth rates are not really rising. Arizona is the worst still, or again, and its growth rate is arguably rising just a little bit, but it's not sharp. I'm going to show a comparison. Let's look at Florida for comparison. Actually, I'm going to zoom out first. Just going to make it look weird for a minute, then I'm going to add Florida in. That is what it looks like when growth rates are rising. That's Florida. Florida up at 8%, a very high rate, while the remainder of what were the hottest spots 3 weeks ago, Arizona and all the rest of the gang of 6, they're not quite declining. None of them have dropped to 0 yet, though it seems like North Carolina is close. It's 0.3% growth, 4% growth, 0.4% growth for this most recent day, and headed downwards. So North Carolina seems like it might turn the corner towards negative growth any day now, in a matter of days, maybe a week. Similarly with Utah, those have been the 2 that have recovered fastest. But the other 4 also, their growth rates are no longer rising, not much, just a little bit. For Alabama, 3% and rising. In Arizona, 5% and rising. But these used to be up in the area of Florida. So there's kind of a gravity effect pulling these 6 states downward. And so this is what we're seeing, where states that have it, states that get it badly, look like Florida, and then 4 weeks later, they start to they typically have peaked in this graph and tend to cross 0, the 0 line, and then they start to peak in the total cases graph, the daily cases graph, and their number of cases start to drop. So there's this trend, and we saw it. I talked about this some in the last live stream, I think. There's a real trend that states, I'm going to get rid of the crazy one here again, Rhode Island, though it's not too far off. It's doing kind of its own thing as well, where it also peaked very high. The data is weird, but the trend is still fairly clear. It peaked high, it stayed high, and now it's mostly low, mostly having recovered in Rhode Island, but it just messes up the general look of the graph to have it in there, and it's such a small outlier that it can be, I think, safely omitted. But most states, there's a general trend that states peak once they hit 100, they rise for a while, they peak at maybe 30 days, they drop for a while, and then they're kind of over it, under 100, around 60 days. And they usually don't come back. We still have this one extreme exception, Louisiana, which is now a hot spot, having peaked and apparently recovered, but never quite recovered. And then, to some degree, Delaware, also getting warm. I'm going to look in on those in a minute. But the rest of the states that have peaked have then recovered and remain low. And these tend to be these New England states, or the second wave states like Michigan. So this is, I think, that same effect happening out to the gang of 6. Arizona, the news on Arizona still is, oh no, we're having more and more cases every day. Well, yes, we are having more and more cases in Arizona every day. The news is correct, 5 or 6% every day, more cases than we had the day before. But the good news is that if you look a little bit deeper into this graph, you see this curve is starting to flatten out, even if the daily cases aren't yet. And once it does, and once it starts heading downward, as we're already seeing with at least Utah, North Carolina, and really to some degree with Arkansas, and maybe South Carolina, at least flat. Once that heads downward, then at least we can see that it's heading towards zero. And once it heads towards zero, then we'll start to see fewer and fewer cases every day. So there's the gang of 6. If you look at that 6% number, 5 or 6% number, that's the very worst of the gang of 6. And then look at all of the states, all of the hottest states in daily cases per million. And you see that there are a whole lot of states now. There's this whole new gang, I guess, that's really above the gang of 6, which is the latest hot wave. Gang of 6 is kind of last week's news. They're starting to move towards getting over it, but the ones that aren't getting over it and aren't moving in that direction at all are Idaho, 10% growth, Florida, 8% growth, Kansas, 7% growth, Nevada, Georgia, Delaware, Tennessee, all above 6%, and Guam, Oklahoma, Arizona, and you have to get all the way down here before we see the worst of the gang of 6. All these other ones are accelerating very fast, looking much worse than the gang of 6. And again, Arizona is the worst of the gang of 6. We got everyone else in the gang of 6 is even better. And then we've got Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina. There again is the tip of the gang of 6. So it appears that we have a group of perhaps 10 states, maybe there's 8 of them, that are worse than the gang of 6 and are our new upcoming wave of states. And you see Florida in the news. Florida is very much news now, and as it should be. Arizona is maybe falling out of the news, but not Florida. Florida is looking terrible. In fact, let's look at some of these on this graph. This graph is adjusted to show the time since it reached 100 daily cases per million. So this is not chronological. It's not dates at the bottom like most of my graphs. It's the days since each state reached 100. So it lets us compare the trajectories, even for states that caught the disease at different times. So here's New Jersey, certainly the worst. New Jersey peaked at above 500 even in its 14-day moving average, so it really was bad, but has now largely recovered. At least it's down to under 50. We do see this theme where some states will hover under 100 and they'll just sort of stay there. California did this for a long time, and to some degree that's what Louisiana has done as well. It never quite recovered. It was at 70 and 70 and 70, and yes, it was no longer warm in the sense that I call it warm, but it never recovered, and now it's breaking out again. New Jersey, New York, these have recovered further down into in the case of New York, it's into the teens, very strong recovery. New Jersey, not quite so good, but at least under 50. So there's the trajectory of New Jersey. Now here's the trajectory of Arizona, and you can see Arizona really is exceptionally bad. And this graph doesn't show much of a sign that it's getting better, but you might look at it and say there's just a hint that it's not shooting straight upwards anymore. It's starting to bend, and that's what our rope chart is looking at, saying, well, there's a little bit of a bend there. And so we think that Arizona is starting to flatten off, or might be starting to flatten off. It might actually peak right around here, and maybe then we'll head downward and hit 100 at the 60-day mark, like so many states have done. So Arizona so far isn't bucking the trend. It seems to be following the trend, except that it just got it a whole lot higher. It's up at 500 daily cases per million, even in its average. And at 30 days, it's 30 days in, 27 days in, it's the 29 days in? Yeah, 29 days in. It's the only state that has been anywhere near that at 29 days in. New Jersey, 3 weeks in, was about in the same category, but then it got better. So Arizona is the worst really in some sense the worst state of all in its trajectory, and we don't yet see that it's clearly getting better. There are hints of that. In some ways, even worse is Florida. Florida is only 16 days in since it hit its warm spot at 100, but it is above Arizona. It's above where Arizona was at that time. So Florida, it's not quite as bad as New Jersey in the way New Jersey just shot up to 300 in like a day. This is following a slightly more sedate trajectory, but Arizona looked really bad at that point, and this is it's even worse. So who knows where Florida's going? There's just no hint in that graph that it's getting better yet. So we'll be watching Florida. If it follows other states, it will peak somewhere around the 30-day mark, which is just a couple weeks from now. But who knows? Maybe it'll be an exception and it doesn't do something completely different and go to 5,000. We'll see. And then we've got, let's just look at one other. Sure, let's look at Idaho. I think that Idaho doesn't have many cases yet. So this is one of the, we'll see. Is it here? Well, it's got enough to be on this graph, but it only just hit 100 about 6 days ago. When we zoom in, it hit 100 6 days ago. So when we look at it on the total graph, it's just a little blip here. Can't even find it. But it is rising quickly, and so Idaho is probably going to become one of these, maybe something like Florida, something like Arizona. Very plausible given that acceleration. It's going to be one of the higher ones in the next couple of weeks, and certainly at this point not recovering. And then I guess Kansas. Let's see, is Kansas here? Yep, Kansas is here. Can we flash the Kansas line? Here again, Kansas I think has just gotten here. Yeah, it's literally, it only has 1 day. It just hit 100 pretty much today. So we don't have a graph on it, but Kansas rising quickly has just gotten warm, and we'll see where its trajectory falls in there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at hospitalizations and testing because I haven't been doing that, and I do want to bring that into the picture a little bit again. So hospitalizations are a good way to see whether how bad the disease really is. They are not affected by testing typically. We could do no testing at all, and we would still be getting hospitalizations because people don't go to the hospital because they tested positive. They go to the hospital because they can't breathe. And so these, when we see these rising, these lines rising, it's a total mess. I'll be taking a bunch of stuff out of this graph, but just very broadly, we see a lot of things falling, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and generally the East Coast, Northeast, not so much the Southeast. These are the ones that had a very high hospitalization rates, 20-30%, and have fallen very sharply. But then we see lines like this one here, Georgia. And I'm going to go through one at a time for a little bit. And again, I'm not going to get to the counties today, mostly because the county data is whacked. Not just because the data set's screwed up. I don't know why. My input, my graphs are only as good as their input, and the input right now is showing no change for 4 days for the counties of California. So that gives me more time to focus on the states, which are probably more interesting anyway right now. The news for the counties of California is generally everyone's rising, and that hasn't changed for days. And I don't know, maybe it has changed, but if so, I can't tell because my data doesn't have data for today. So back to the states. Georgia looking roughly speaking 8%, 10%, I think. We'll see. I don't quite know what a good line is to say this is really bad, but 10% is certainly bad. I think I was using 8% as indicating something's bad, but even more is the question of, is it rising or not? The trend line isn't super sharply upwards, but you really can see that in the past month, Georgia's short-term trend has been sharply upwards, down from a somewhat respectable 7% up to an entirely disrespectable 15%. So Georgia looking quite bad. South Carolina also rising, not as bad as Georgia. Virginia's looking pretty good though. There's a real cluster. up here. As I sometimes say, one data point way off the trend line, it could be noise. Two data points might be a coincidence. 3 is starting to be a habit. 4, I would call a trend. And at 5, there's really something going on here. These 5 data points are something new. It's not just random. Could be some change of reporting, but I'm guessing not. I'm guessing that Virginia has suddenly seen a radical increase in hospitalizations. So even though the trend line says downward, I'm going to keep Virginia in this list as one of the trouble states. Florida, somewhat surprisingly, isn't off the charts, because it is off the charts in some other ways, like total cases per day. It's just really rising terribly fast. Hospitalization's not going quite so fast, but it's bad. We are seeing 11%, but this does suggest there may be a combination of factors driving Florida. In particular, what we may be seeing is very high testing in Florida as everyone flees to their testing centers in terror. We may be seeing a lot of cases that are mild being detected in Florida, which drives the cases up without actually indicating without affecting hospitalizations. So there's always this question of to what degree are new cases just a result of higher testing. We've seen a lot of cases where that's not the whole picture, but there's some of that going on as well, and maybe Florida is one of them, just as indicated by the fact that it's in the middle of the pack here, whereas at the top of the pack in new daily cases. Mississippi, things getting pretty ugly here. Mississippi is so. They've got some slightly lower points now than at their worst, so I'm going to take them out of this list of the really, really hard hit ones. Arizona had this weird thing where they just drop in a perfectly straight line in hospitalizations, almost to 0, and then came back again. I wondered about whether this could possibly be real. I had a wild theory that maybe they were just shipping a bunch of people out of state for a while. Every day they were going to ship, just to make sure their hospitals didn't get overloaded, they were going to ship them to, I don't know, New York or something. But I don't know that anyone really does that, so I'm guessing this is just a data anomaly. In any case, if it is, it's come back, it's over that, and the trend line is successfully angling upwards again. And Arizona's looking bad at 11% hospitalization and rising. Arkansas also. Utah, not so great either. Oklahoma, rising. When we were looking at hospitalizations a month or 2 ago, everything was trending downward. And so the fact that so many states are trending upward really indicates a problem here. You can hardly even see with New Mexico. The dots are a little hard to see. The trend line claims downward, but if you look at those yellow dots, it was at 4% a couple weeks ago, and now it's at 10%. New Mexico also has a problem. It's a sort of a short-term trend, but plenty of points there to say that's real. South Dakota, at least, doesn't seem to have a problem. New Jersey, this is kind of backwards. New Jersey has all these weird zeros way back when, but the trend overall for New Jersey is it was 16% 4 weeks ago, a month ago, and now it's down to 6%. So New Jersey is getting better. Trend line says it's upward, but that's just because it doesn't know what to do about these zeros back here. New Jersey's trend line for the past month, clearly downward. I'll take it off the list. Tennessee might be coming into a problem. It's definitely angled upwards, which is unusual, or it was 2 months ago. Doesn't look so unusual now. Everyone's angled upwards, but it doesn't have it as bad as some. I guess I'll leave it on the list, but it's not. It's growing, but not yet at a really bad number. And Alabama is kind of like that too. It even has a mini trend downward. I'm actually going to take Alabama out of here. It seems to be flat. Alabama doesn't have a particularly bad problem. Nebraska, much like New Jersey, had a bunch of zeros. The data set is just now starting to track their hospitalizations, and it seems to me like it's dropping recently. That certainly their last few days are in the 3% range. Nebraska seems to be doing okay. I don't know what to say about Connecticut. Probably dropping. Maryland, generally the Northeast is always looking good. Washington State, rising for sure, but at a very low 5%, fairly low 5%. They may be coming back into a problem, but no big deal yet. Ohio also in that 5% range might be problematic. Rhode Island definitely getting better. Indiana maybe showing a little bit of a trend. Kansas just a tiny bit up. We're getting into these 5% ranges that someday, when I come back to this in 4 weeks, I may totally be flagging Ohio as a problem, because what's now looks like a mini trend of these pink things headed upwards may be have pushed it into the 10 or 15% range. But for now, I'm going to say these are the problems, and this is sorted roughly by which states have problems. It is worth noting, sadly, that some major states do not have data. California, flatline. Texas, flatline. We can't, this data set is run by volunteers, and apparently there are no volunteers in Texas contributing to covidtracking.com or California. And so there are some states which we know are worse. North Carolina probably has a problem as well, but we just know from other graphs there are the other states, like probably Texas and California, that belong here that aren't here because the data set doesn't track them. But what we do know is that whereas a month ago, or maybe 2 months ago, these lines were all headed downward. I think all of them. Go look at the first time I introduced this graph a month or two ago, everyone was headed downward. No longer the case. And this is a graph, again, that strongly indicates that this is not just due to better testing. Better testing would not drive hospitalizations upwards in this way. And so we have a legitimate, widespread epidemic sweeping many, many states as these numbers rise.